Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, I'm Richard York. I work at ARM, and I'm responsible for all of ARM's embedded technologies. Very, very broad and a huge space. I've been doing this for nearly 20 years. One of the things that IoT is really doing for me is democratizing and advertising and making very visible embedded technology to the masses. Embedded has always been an exciting area of technology. For me, the public is now becoming excited about embedded technology and what it can do for them. So I'm going to talk this morning about principally the end nodes, the things that we all have in our hands, the things that we have in our homes, the things that are close to us, what we call the edge of the Internet of Things. Because I think that's the area that's most exciting. And what I've done on the screen here is collected together many, many of those areas where we're going to see Internet of Things devices affecting us. Now, in some cases, they're already affecting us. You can see on the left-hand side, the industrial market, for example. It's been essentially building Internet of Things devices by a different name for decades. But we can see other applications, and we've seen those in our previous presenters, really where embedded technology is starting to change people's lives. That's why I summarized here, the elderly, pets, animals, teenagers, monitoring all of those in an appropriate way that allows us to understand more about them, and for them really to get some benefit from embedded technology. One thing you can see here is the diversity of all of these end applications. There's a huge, huge amount of diversity. And every one of these endpoint solutions is going to look a little bit different. It's going to need a slightly different technological solution. And that's the core of my talk this morning. It's about diversity. Because it's the diversity in those end devices that's so critical. Those end devices are changing. They're changing in a number of different ways. They're changing because they're becoming connected. They're entering the Internet of Things. And they're also changing because they're becoming more sophisticated. And we saw this a little bit in the previous presentation. They're gaining high-quality displays. They're gaining touch displays. They're controlling, in many cases, lots of motors. They're gaining touch sense, even voice recognition. So alongside devices and products becoming connected, devices are also becoming more sophisticated. And that's driving this diversity. Now, ARM, I'm sure hopefully you all understand, we develop embedded processor technology. That's the heart of our business. It's the fundamental part of our business. It's what we've done for more than 20 years. And that diversity I've just talked about is mirrored in the diversity of ARM's products. So on one extreme, we have processors and products that allow rich operating systems, Linux, Windows, Android to be run. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've got the smallest, tiniest processors you can imagine to enable those tiny little microcontrollers and those little speech sensors that you might have, those little MEMS sensors that you might have embedded in those toys. So this spectrum, this huge spectrum of solutions to build these endpoints is tremendously important. Let me give you some examples for wearables. It's a very hot topic nowadays. We see wearables everywhere. But even in wearables, we see this huge spectrum of requirements. So the simple wearable device might well be a Misfit, for example, a little Misfit Shine. Very simple user interface, might be a bunch of LEDs. Connectivity, perhaps simple as Bluetooth Low Energy, Bluetooth Smart. Now, the battery life of these things has to be a long, long time. And previous presenter picked up quite a lot on energy efficiency. You'll see this in much of what I'm going to talk about here. Energy efficiency crosses almost every one of these applications. So one extreme of wearables is an extremely simple device built with a very tiny, low-cost microcontroller. Battery life we want in the period of weeks and months. A more sophisticated one, though, might well now have audio. It might have an LCD on it. It'll have full Bluetooth, it'll have a basic user interface. But still we want battery life in weeks, not days. And if we look at the most extreme, and this might be something that you're visually watching, at this point we can see a great deal of sophistication. It'll be running a rich operating system. It'll have multiple forms of connectivity. It'll at this point probably be voice controlled. And we saw that again from Andrea's presentation. Voice and MEMS microphones and the voice processing is becoming an increasingly important part of products. So huge breadth and huge variability in those endpoints, just in the wearable space. And that breadth of technology is also very visible in the communication standards that these products embody. So on the left-hand side, you can see here what a typical web browser would do when it communicates. So thousands of bytes for every communication activity. But that's not good enough for many of these devices, because these devices are resource limited, they're power limited. So you can see standards in the middle which are being developed to talk to those gateways, not thousands but hundreds of bytes for every form of communication. And then the most extreme, those tiny sensors, which we'll talk more about in a second, those tiny sensors, you want to be exchanging no more than tens of bytes every time you talk to them, because they might have a tiny button cell, or they might be energy harvesting. They might have a very, very low power radio. So the diversity of the communication standards to these endpoints is important. Now, I like tearing apart products and I like looking at what these Internet of Things edge devices have inside them. Partly because it's fun, partly because it's also nice to see just how much ARM technology is embedded in them. And we looked here at one of these little watches. And in fact, you can see here some of the technology that we just heard about. There's accelerometers. There's those sensors again. And there's a tiny, tiny ARM-based microcontroller that's powering these things. Another really interesting IoT endpoint is in the space of robotics. And we found this little remote control car. If you haven't seen these, I encourage you to go and look at them. They're called an Anki. They're wonderful little things. I remember when I was a child playing with very, very basic radio control cars. And they were basically functionless. They went around a track and they did very little. These are wonderful little things. They've got image recognition even built into them, so that they can spot the surroundings. They can follow tracks that people put on the ground. This is an example of what I talked about earlier, where it's not only the connectivity that's being added, but the increased functionality that's being added. Again, an ARM-based microcontroller, an ST-based microcontroller even, an image sensor, all of these things that are making these products sophisticated, and yet they're still low cost. And the last example, well, not quite the last, but one example, quadcopters. Another example of a consumer product that was initially an expensive toy, has become now a commoditized toy, but increasingly is becoming something that's useful socially. So, for example, these things are being used to monitor crops. They're being used by the emergency services to monitor the scenes. And what do they need? Well, they need lots of sophisticated processing. This is why the depth and diversity of these endpoints is so interesting, because these products are all very different. They all need different solutions. There's even, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, but even applications where we embed technology in farm animals so that we can monitor their health. You know, so many examples of embedding technology, and I don't really want to think where these are embedded in this case. So many examples of where you embed technology. But it's the development environment, perhaps that's the most interesting part of all this, because when I was an engineer many years ago, I programmed in assembler. Things moved on and people programmed in C. But now people are programming on platforms. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Let's look briefly though at those microcontrollers again. So we started 10 years ago really revolutionizing the microcontroller world. And we did that with something called Cortex-M3. We did that very recently with the very low-cost microcontrollers. You can now get a 32-bit sophisticated micro for tens of cents. And only last week we announced something called Cortex-M7. That's going to double the amount of performance in an affordable microcontroller. So again, it's going to completely change the types of endpoints people can build. And that's powering choice. So we estimate there's nearly 3,500 standard products based on ARM technology that a system builder, an IoT endpoint designer can choose from. That's an enormous choice, but you have to have that much choice if you're going to build the rich diversity of products that I talked about at the beginning. So I'm going to finish on those development platforms. Because of the development platforms that are changing the way people develop products. All of that hardware is great, but you need to build on top of it. You need to prototype rapidly. You need to develop software rapidly. And again, many of these are based on ARM technology, which I'm really quite proud of. So for example, the product on the left, it's Raspberry Pi. It says 2.5 million on that slide. 3 million of these Raspberry Pis have been shipped since it started 2 years ago. That's an enormous amount of hardware that people are now rapid prototyping and developing on top of. Arduino as well. Many of the next generation of Arduino technology is based on ARM. One that I'd encourage all of you to look at if you've not seen this before, and that's the technology called Electric Imp. Again, relatively new. All of this has come up in the last 2 years. This is a great example of something that was built from the ground up to enable connectivity and sophisticated technology to be added into a product. So yes, if you've not looked at Electric Imp, please take a look at it, because what they've achieved in a very short period of time and how they've transformed the way people build connected products is amazing. So IoT. 3 things really I'd like to summarize here. It's the small endpoints, those millions, those billions of endpoints that will be powered by tiny, low-cost micros, tiny, low-cost microprocessors that's going to change things. And that diversity is hugely important. One size does not fit all in those endpoints. Secondly, the innovation that's going on in the chip vendors is huge. So for example, you can now buy a 32-bit microcontroller that's 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters. It's absolutely tiny. You can imagine the sort of endpoints that you could embed that in and the sort of form factors you can build. And last, but actually the most important, are these software development platforms that are being built on these low-cost micros, these low-cost microprocessors. They're just amazing, and they are changing the way people build products, radically changing the way they prototype and how they bring these products to market. And I'm very proud to see that most of those, almost all of those, are based on ARM technology. I'm looking forward to an interesting Q&A later. Thank you very much.